The lights in the lecture hall flickered for a moment. Only half a second. But that was the only warning I got. I was sitting in the third row of Xenobiology 210, trying to focus on the lesson. My stylus was resting on a blank data slate, and I was waiting for the professor to continue. Everything seemed normal, until the air beside me changed. I felt it before I even understood what was happening. A strange pressure moved through the room. The same feeling you get when something huge moves quickly in a space that is too small. My body reacted before my mind did. Something was coming. Then suddenly, the chair next to me dragged across the floor with a loud screech. The entire lecture hall went silent. I slowly turned my head, and there he was, Korath Vest, standing right beside me. He was one of the most intimidating alien students on campus. His massive body blocked the light above me. His four eyes stared down at me like he was studying a strange creature. His large shoulder plates expanded outward, almost twice their normal size. That was a warning sign. Everyone knew what it meant. A Korath did not spread their shoulder plates unless they were angry, excited, or preparing for a challenge. And right now, Korath Vest looked ready for all three. The students around us stopped talking. Some moved their chairs away. Others watched with curiosity. Because everyone knew one thing. A human sitting beside a Korath was unusual. A human being approached by a Korath was almost unheard of. I had no idea why he was standing there. I had never spoken to him. I had never challenged him. I had never even looked in his direction. But now this giant alien warrior was standing over me in the middle of class. The room waited. Everyone expected me to panic. They expected me to move away. But I stayed in my seat. I looked up at him and simply asked, "Can I help you?" For a moment, nobody moved. Korath Vest's four eyes widened slightly. Maybe he expected fear. Maybe he expected me to run. But humans had a strange habit. When something bigger and stronger tried to intimidate us, we looked back. And that was the moment I realized something. Whatever reason brought Korath Vest to my desk. It was going to change everything. I did not move at first, not because I was afraid, because my mind was still finishing the sentence it had been writing about atmospheric composition on a moon called Ressa Prime. And it took my brain a fraction of a second to catch up with what my eyes were already reporting. Korath Vest was a Drevan, and Dravans do not do subtlety. Standing close to 2.5 meters tall, built like a slab of reinforced alloy wrapped in gray hide. He had spent the last 4 months finding small ways to remind me that humans were, in his words, soft-shelled little things that talk too much and hit too little. He had bumped my shoulder in hallways. He had knocked my books from my hands twice, always managing to look like it was an accident to any professor who happened to glance over. He had made comments in that low, rasping, driven accent about how humans were led into this academy as a courtesy, not because we belonged. I had ignored all of it, not out of fear, but out of strategy. In a school with over 40 species, most of them physically larger than me, reacting to every provocation would have made me a target for every bully looking to make a name for himself. So I stayed quiet. I studied. I passed every combat evaluation with scores that made the instructors raise an eyebrow, then say nothing because humans were not supposed to be good at that sort of thing, according to the general assumption floating around campus. That morning, something in Korath finally snapped. Or maybe he had simply run out of patience for my patience. He grabbed my collar with one massive hand and hauled me half out of my chair. The classroom went dead silent. Around me, other cadetses, a pair of Salari with their soft blue skin and wide black eyes, a cluster of insectoid Tavik students with their clicking mandibles frozen mid-motion. All of them stared without moving, without speaking, as if intervening might somehow make things worse for them. Professor Ilian Sora, our Solari Xenobiology instructor, stood at the front of the room with a data pointer still raised, her mouth slightly open, caught in that terrible pause. Adults sometimes have when violence erupts faster than authority can respond. Korath leaned his broad face close to mine. His breath smelled like ozone and something metallic. "You do not belong here, human," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through my chest. "I'm going to make sure everyone remembers that today." I looked at his hand fisted in my collar. I looked at his eyes, all 4 of them locked onto my face, waiting for the fear he expected to see. He did not find it. What he found instead was a strange stillness, the kind that comes not from courage exactly, but from calculation. In the half-second his grip tightened around my collar. My mind was already running through everything my body had trained for since I was 11 years old. Hand-to-H hand certification, joint locks, pressure points, the specific vulnerabilities of a Dreven's neural cluster located just beneath the collarbone ridge, a detail I had memorized purely out of academic curiosity months earlier and never expected to use. He shoved. My chair toppled backward, and I let it using the fall to roll my shoulder and come up onto one knee instead of my back. The way I had drilled 1,000 times in a gym half a galaxy away from this room. The classroom gasped. Someone's data slate clattered to the floor. Korath grinned, mistaking my recovery for panic rather than preparation. He stepped forward, raising a hand the size of a dinner plate. That was the last mistake he made standing up. I do not remember consciously deciding to move. I remember the room narrowing to a single point of focus the way it always did in training. My peripheral vision fading until there was only him, his center of mass, his weight distribution, the half-second gap between his intention and his action. I stepped inside his reach instead of away from it, which nobody in that room expected, least of all him. My palm struck the base of his throat. Not hard enough to cause real damage, but precisely enough to interrupt his balance and his breath. At the same moment, he staggered. I used that half-second to drop low and drive my shoulder into his midsection, redirecting all that towering mass sideways instead of down onto me. Korath Vess, a cadet who outweighed me by what must have been 150 pounds, who had spent his whole life being the strongest thing in any room he entered, hit the floor of that lecture hall with a crash that rattled the desks. The silence afterward was so complete I could hear my own pulse. I stood over him, breathing hard but steady, my collar still crooked from where he had grabbed it. And for the first time since I had arrived at this academy, nobody in that room was looking at me like I was small. Professor Sora finally moved, stepping down from the platform with her data pointer forgotten in her hand, her wide black eyes flicking between Korath on the floor and me standing above him. Around the room, cadets who had not dared breathe were now leaning forward in their seats, whispering to each other in 6 different languages. All of them saying some version of the same thing. Did you see that? I did not answer anyone. I bent down, picked up my fallen data slate, and set it back on my desk with hands that were only shaking a little. Korath groaned and pushed himself up onto one elbow, his 4 eyes blinking hard, focusing on me with something that had not been there a minute earlier. Not the contempt from before, something closer to confusion, maybe even the beginning of respect he would never openly admit to. You hit like a Draven, he rasped, one hand pressed to his throat. I hit like someone who is done being underestimated, I said. Professor Sora cleared her throat, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of every unspoken rule about violence in her classroom, and called for both of us to accompany her to the administration office immediately. As she said it, I noticed her eyes lingering on me a moment longer than they lingered on Korath. And I understood even then that whatever came next would not be simple. Because in that room, an alien had attacked a human, expecting no resistance, and instead he had found out exactly how wrong that expectation was. I picked up my satchel, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door without looking back at the whispers following me out. Whatever happened next, in the offices, in the hallways, in the quiet judgments of 40 different species trying to decide what they had just witnessed, I already knew one thing for certain. Nobody at this academy would ever look at me the same way again. The walk from the lecture hall to the administration wing felt longer than it had any right to be. Korath limped a few steps behind me, one hand still pressed to his throat, flanked by Professor Sora, who kept glancing over her shoulder at both of us like she expected the fight to reignite in the corridor. Cadets pressed themselves against the walls as we passed, their conversations dying midward, their eyes following me with an expression I had never once seen directed at me before. Not pity, not mockery, something closer to caution. A Tavik cadet named OSU, who I recognized from my orbital mechanics class, fell into step beside me for a few seconds, his mandibles clicking softly in what I had learned was his species equivalent of a whisper. That was the cleanest counter I have seen a first-year cadet perform, he said. Even upper years struggle against Dreven, Massachusetts. I did not answer him. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the fall, the sound of Korath hitting the floor, the silence that followed. I did not feel triumphant. I felt strangely hollow, the way you do after your body does something your mind has not fully caught up with yet. The administration office sat at the top level of the academy spire, a curved room with windows overlooking the training yards below, where cadets of a dozen species ran drills against a backdrop of distant orbital rings. Commandant Varric Halden, a broad-shouldered Corvith male with slate-cold skin and a voice like gravel shifting underfoot, sat behind a desk that seemed carved from a single piece of dark stone. He did not stand when we entered. He simply folded his hands and studied the two of us with an expression that gave nothing away. Professor Sora explained what she had witnessed in clipped, careful sentences. Careful in the way people are when they know their account will be measured against other accounts. Corith Vest initiated physical contact against Cadet Claire Bennett without provocation. Cadet Bennett responded with a defensive counter that resulted in Cadet Vest losing balance and falling. Halden's eyes moved to me first, not to COR, and something about that order of attention made my stomach tighten. "Is this accurate, Cadet Bennett?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. He grabbed my collar and pulled me from my chair. I defended myself. Halden's gaze shifted to Corith, who stood with his massive arms crossed, his throat still faintly bruised where my palm had connected. "And your account, Cadet Vest?" COR was quiet for a long moment, his four eyes flicking toward me once before settling back on the Commandant. I expected him to lie. I expected him to claim I had attacked first, to twist the story the way bullies so often do when the tables turn against them. Instead, he said something that surprised everyone in that room, myself included. "She defended herself," he admitted, his rasping voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "I underestimated her. That is the truth of it." Halden's expression did not change, but I noticed his fingers tap once against the stone desk, a small motion that somehow conveyed more than any words could have. "This is not the first report I have received about Cadet Vests and his conduct towards smaller species cadets," he said finally, his eyes sliding to a data display embedded in his desk. "There are 3 prior incidents logged against you, Cadet Vest, none of which resulted in formal discipline because none of the involved parties were willing to file a complaint." I felt something cold settle in my chest at that. 3 prior incidents. 3 other cadets, presumably smaller, presumably less prepared than I had been, who had endured whatever Karath dished out and said nothing, either out of fear or out of the same calculation I had made for months. The belief that silence was safer than confrontation. Halden turned his attention fully to me now, his gravel voice taking on a weight I had not expected. "Cadet Bennett, your combat evaluation scores are the highest recorded for a first-year human cadet in this academy's history. I confess I found the numbers difficult to credit when I first reviewed them. I no longer find them difficult to credit. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, standing straight, my hands folded behind my back the way we had been trained to stand before ranking officers. "There will be a formal hearing," Halden continued. "Given the severity of the physical altercation and the prior pattern of behavior now on record, this cannot be resolved with a simple reprimand. Cadet Vest, you are suspended from active classes pending review. Cadet Bennett, you will be asked to give testimony along with any other cadets who wish to come forward regarding similar incidents." Corith's shoulders sagged slightly at the word suspended, the first sign of genuine emotion I had seen from him that was not aggression or contempt. For a species that measured worth, almost entirely through physical standing among peers, suspension carried a weight I could only partially understand. As we were dismissed from the office, Professor Sora lingered behind to speak privately with the Commandant and Korath, and I found ourselves walking the same corridor back toward the dormitory wings, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. "I did not think a human could do that," he said eventually, not looking at me. "Do what?" I asked. "Move like that, fight like that, recover from a fall, and turn it into an advantage in under a second. I have trained against driven opponents twice my size who could not manage that." I studied him for a moment. This creature who had spent 4 months treating me like something beneath his notice, now walking beside me with something that almost resembled humility. "Humans are not weak," I said. "We have just learned to choose our moments." He did not respond to that, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, and I understood in that instant that whatever story spread through this academy over the coming days would not be the one he might have hoped for. By the time I reached the dormitory wing, the story had already outpaced me. Cadets I had never spoken to greeted me by name in the hallway. A group of Salari students, usually reserved almost to the point of silence, actually stopped their conversation to watch me pass, their wide black eyes tracking me with open curiosity. In the common room, a human cadet named Owen Marsh, one of only 6 other humans enrolled at the academy that term, waved me over with an expression somewhere between disbelief and delight. "Please tell me it's true," he said. "Please tell me you put Vest on the floor in the middle of xenobiology." I did not respond right away. I was too distracted by a message notification blinking on my personal data slate, an unfamiliar name attached to it. A cadet I did not recognize requesting to speak with me about, in her words, something similar to what happened today. I opened the message and read the first line and felt that cold feeling in my chest return heavier this time. "My name is Priya Anand," it began. "I think Korath Ves has been doing this to more of us than anyone realizes, and I did not know who else to tell." I stared at the message for a long moment before I looked up at Owen, who was still waiting for my answer, his expression slowly shifting as he read something in my face that told him this was no longer a simple story about one fight in one classroom. "There's more to this than what happened today," I said quietly, "and I think I am about to find out exactly how much more." I met Priya Anand 2 hours later in a quiet study alcove on the lower level of the academy library, a curved glass space overlooking the artificial lake that sat at the center of the campus grounds. She was a small woman shorter than me, with dark hair pulled back tightly and hands that would not stop moving, twisting the strap of her satchel over and over as she spoke. "I did not think anyone would believe me," she said. "Once I have shown up without bruises visible enough to prove anything. He is careful about that. He knows exactly how hard to push without leaving marks that would show up on a medical scan." I felt my jaw tighten at that. Careful, calculated. Not the actions of a creature simply losing his temper, but something closer to a pattern, refined over time, aimed at cadets he judged too weak or too frightened to report him. "Tell me what happened," I said. Priya's story came out in pieces, hesitant at first, then faster, as if once she started, she could not stop the words from spilling free. 3 months earlier, during a joint engineering exercise, Korath had cornered her in an equipment bay, accused her of sabotaging his team's project, and shoved her hard enough into a metal support strut that she had needed a medical scan afterward. Though the skin showed nothing beyond minor bruising, easily explained away. When she reported it informally to a junior instructor, she was told that interspecies friction during high-stress exercises was common and encouraged to let it go for the sake of academy harmony. I sat with that phrase for a long moment. Interspecies friction. As if what had happened to her was a difference of opinion rather than an assault. "You are not the only one, are you?" I said quietly. Priya shook her head. "There is another cadet, a Solari named Ketverth, who transferred out of 2 shared classes with COR rather than report anything at all. And I have heard whispers about at least one more, though I do not know the name." By the time I left that study alcove, the cold feeling in my chest had hardened into something sharper, something closer to purpose. I understood now that the fight in the lecture hall had not been an isolated event, a single moment of a bully finally overreaching. It had been the visible tip of something the Academy's administration had chosen again and again not to see clearly. That evening I requested a formal meeting with Commandant Halden, and this time I did not go alone. Priya came with me along with Ket Vareth, the Solari cadet whose name Priya had mentioned, a slender being with pale lavender skin and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against some remembered discomfort. Owen Marsh insisted on accompanying us as well, not to testify since he had no direct experience with COR, but simply to stand in the hallway outside the office, as he put it, in case anyone needed a friendly face afterward. Halden received the 3 of us in his office with the same unreadable expression he had worn earlier that day. Though I noticed his gaze sharpened slightly when Priya and Ket introduced themselves and began slowly at first to lay out their own experiences. Ket's account, when it finally came, was the hardest to hear. Korath had not simply pushed or shoved him. He had cornered Ket after a training exercise, isolated from any witnesses, and made it clear through implication and physical intimidation that any report of his behavior would result in consequences far worse than what had already occurred. Ket had spent the better part of 2 months rearranging his entire class schedule simply to avoid being in the same room as Korath Ves, sacrificing coursework he had been passionate about in the process. Halden listened to all of this without interrupting. his stone-colored fingers occasionally tapping against the data display embedded in his desk, cataloging each detail as it was spoken. When Ket finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that seems to press against your ears. "This is a significant escalation from what I understood this morning," Halden said finally. "A single altercation is a disciplinary matter. A pattern of intimidation deliberately concealed from staff, spanning multiple victims across multiple species, is something else entirely." I stepped forward then, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto my shoulders in a way I had not expected. "With respect, Commandant," I said, "this pattern was not entirely concealed. Priya attempted to report an incident 3 months ago and was told to consider it interspecies friction. If that report had been taken seriously then, Cadet VYTH might not have spent 2 months restructuring his education around avoiding a fellow cadet." Alden's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something flicker across his expression that looked almost like discomfort. "You are suggesting institutional failure," he said. "I am stating it directly," I answered, "because I believe it is true, and because I believe pretending otherwise will only ensure this happens again with the next cadet, who is smaller or quieter than their aggressor." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if I had overstepped, if my directness would be read as insubordination rather than honesty. Then Halden did something I had not expected. He nodded once slowly and reached toward his desk display. "You are correct, Cadet Bennett," he said. "And I intend to address that failure, not simply the immediate matter of Cadet Vess's conduct. This academy exists to train cadets from every corner of known space to work together despite our differences. That mission fails entirely if smaller or quieter cadets learn that reporting harm is pointless." Over the following 2 days, the investigation widened far beyond what I had anticipated. Instructors who had previously dismissed complaints as friction were formally interviewed about their handling of prior reports. A pattern emerged that was uglier than even Priya or Ket had fully realized. 3 additional cadets from smaller statured species came forward once word spread that the Academy was finally taking the matter seriously, each with their own account of intimidation, isolation, or quiet physical dominance exercised by Karath Vest over the preceding year. I found myself somewhat to my own surprise becoming a kind of unofficial point of contact for cadets who were still hesitant to approach administration directly. Word had spread quickly through the dormitory wings about what had happened in the lecture hall, and with it an odd kind of trust had formed around me, as if my willingness to fight back had given others permission to speak up about experiences they had been carrying alone. Not everyone reacted well to this shift. On the 3rd day after the incident, I was crossing the central courtyard toward the training yards when I found my path blocked by 2 other Dreven cadetses, both nearly as large as Karath himself, their broad faces set into expressions of open hostility. "You have caused a great deal of trouble for our clanmate," the larger of the 2 said, his voice carrying the same low rasp I had come to associate with his species. Karath Vest comes from a respected lineage. His suspension brings shame to more than just himself. I stood my ground, feeling the familiar narrowing of focus that had carried me through the fight in the lecture hall, though this time there were 2 opponents instead of 1, and the training yard around us had gone quiet as passing cadets slowed to watch the confrontation unfold. "He attacked me without provocation," I said evenly, "and he intimidated at least 4 other cadets before that. If that brings shame to his lineage, the shame belongs to his choices, not to mine." The second Draven stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the same faint ozone scent that had clung to Karath during our fight. And for a moment, I genuinely believed I was about to face a second physical confrontation in the same week. This one with worse odds than the first. Then a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, and I turned to see Commandant Halden himself crossing the courtyard, his stone-gray features set into an expression that made even the 2 massive Dreven cadetses take an involuntary step back. "Is there a reason the 2 of you are blocking a fellow cadet's path in my training yard?" he asked, his gravel voice carrying easily across the open space. The larger Dreven straightened some old instinct toward hierarchy overriding his anger. "We were simply discussing matters of clan honor with Cadet Bennett. Sir, discuss them somewhere that does not involve cornering a single cadet with 2 of you standing over her," Halden said flatly. or I will add your names to a growing list of cadets I am reviewing for conduct unbecoming an academy representative." The two Dravans exchanged a glance, then stepped aside without further comment, though the larger one's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer. A silent promise of unfinished business that made the hair on my arms rise even after they had walked away. Halden watched them go before turning to me, his expression unreadable once again. "This will not be the last resistance you face, Cadet Bennett," he said. "Some cadetses and unfortunately some instructors will see what happened as a threat to an established order rather than a correction of injustice. You should prepare yourself for that." "I appreciate the warning, sir," I said, "but I would rather face resistance for having done the right thing than comfort for having stayed silent." Something in Halden's expression shifted then, the faintest suggestion of approval crossing his stone features before it vanished behind his usual composure. "The formal hearing has been scheduled for 3 days from now," he said. "You along with Cadets Anand and Virith will be asked to give full testimony. I would advise you to prepare yourselves for a difficult process. Kor Vessa's family carries significant standing within Dreven military circles, and I expect they will not accept these findings without contest." I nodded, understanding the weight of what he was telling me, even as a fresh wave of that cold, sharpening resolve settled over me. Whatever was coming, whatever pressure Kortha's family might bring to bear, whatever resistance rippled through the corridors of this academy in the days ahead, I no longer had any intention of standing quietly aside and hoping the problem resolved itself. I had spent months believing silence was the safer choice. I understood now, walking away from that courtyard with the eyes of a dozen watching cadets still on my back, that silence had only ever protected the people causing harm, never the people receiving it. The hearing would come in 3 days. I intended to be ready for it. The 3 days before the hearing passed, in a strange blur of preparation and quiet dread, I spent my evenings in the library alcove with Priya and Kent, going over our accounts again and again, making certain the details were precise, that nothing could be twisted or dismissed as exaggeration by whatever legal representation Kor's family would send. On the second evening, a formal message arrived on my personal data slate from an address I did not recognize, bearing the seal of the Vest clan, a stylized emblem of interlocking claws over a mountain range. I opened it with a mixture of curiosity and unease that only deepened as I read. The message was from Karatha's mother, a Dreven matriarch named Sia Vess, and it did not contain the threats I had half expected. Instead, it offered what could only be described as an arrangement, a generous scholarship transfer to any academy of my choosing, along with a formal commendation for my combat performance, in exchange for my testimony at the hearing being limited strictly to the single incident in the lecture hall, with no mention of broader patterns or institutional failures. I read the message twice, then a third time, feeling something harden in my chest with each pass. It was elegantly worded, careful never to explicitly ask me to lie, only to ask me to be selective with the truth, to trade the silence of others for a comfortable exit of my own. I did not respond to the message that night. Instead, I forwarded it directly to Commandant Halden with a short note explaining what it contained, and went to sleep with the strange satisfaction of having refused something before I had even fully processed how tempting it might have seemed to someone less certain of their own convictions. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and bright, sunlight slanting through the high windows of the Academy's central chamber, a circular room built to hold formal proceedings of every kind, from academic disputes to disciplinary reviews. Rows of seating rose in tiers around a central floor, and by the time I arrived, nearly every seat was filled. Cadets and instructors from across the academy having gathered to witness what had quickly become the most discussed event of the term. Korth sat at a long table near the front of the chamber, flanked by 2 legal representatives in formal Dreven attire, dark robes marked with the same clawed emblem I had seen on his mother's message. His mother herself sat directly behind him, a tall, imposing figure whose 4 eyes tracked me the moment I entered the room, though her expression revealed nothing. Commandant Halden presided from an elevated seat at the chamber's center, flanked by 2 other senior instructors. I did not recognize, presumably brought in to ensure impartiality, given his own prior involvement in the investigation. The proceedings opened with a formal reading of the charges, cataloging not just the initial altercation, but the pattern of intimidation that had since come to light, involving Priya, Ket, and 3 additional cadets whose accounts had been gathered in the preceding days. As the list grew longer, I watched Karatha's posture shift in his seat, his broad shoulders curling inward slightly. Whether from shame or simple discomfort at having his conduct laid bare before the entire academy, I could not say for certain. When it came time for testimony, I was called first. I walked to the center of the chamber floor with my heart beating steadily. No longer the frantic pulse of that first moment in the lecture hall, but something calmer, more deliberate. I recounted the incident exactly as it had happened. The grip on my collar, the words he had spoken, the fall, the counter, the silence afterward. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The truth spoken plainly carried its own weight in that room. One of Karatha's legal representatives rose to question me once I had finished. A sharp-featured Dreven male whose tone carried an edge of practiced condescension. "Cadet Bennett," he began, "is it not true that your response to Cadet Vess's actions resulted in physical injury to him? Injury which one might argue exceeded the necessity of simple self-defense." I met his gaze without flinching. My response was proportional to the threat presented by a cadet, outweighing me by a significant margin, delivered in a manner designed to end the confrontation as quickly as possible with minimal harm. Had I wished to cause serious injury, I assure you the outcome would have looked considerably different. A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the tiered seating at that, something between amusement and surprise, and I saw the representative's confidence falter slightly before he pressed on with a different line of questioning. This one aimed at suggesting that my willingness to testify against Korath stemmed from some personal grudge rather than genuine concern for other cadets. I answered each question with the same steady calm, refusing to be baited into defensiveness or anger. And by the time I returned to my seat, I could feel the mood of the chamber shifting subtly in a direction that clearly unsettled the Vest family's legal team. Priya's testimony came next, delivered in a voice that trembled at first, but grew steadier as she spoke, describing the equipment bay incident in careful detail, the shove into the metal strut. The instructor, who had dismissed her report as interspecies friction, when she mentioned that dismissal, I saw Commandant Halden's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and I understood that this detail, more than any other, was landing exactly where it needed to. Ketvaretha's testimony was the most difficult to hear. His soft Solari voice describing the 2 months he had spent restructuring his entire education to avoid a single cadet. The isolation he had endured rather than risk further confrontation. By the time he finished, several cadets in the tiered seating had visibly reacted, a few even wiping at their eyes. And I noticed Korath himself staring down at the table before him, his 4 eyes fixed on some point that was not quite anywhere in the room. The 3 additional cadets who had come forward gave shorter accounts, each describing smaller moments of intimidation. A shove here, a threatening word there, none as severe individually as what Priya or Ket had endured, but together painting a picture of sustained deliberate cruelty that no single incident could have conveyed on its own. When it came time for Korath himself to speak, the chamber fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the building's environmental systems overhead. He rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame seeming somehow smaller than it had in the lecture hall days earlier, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the growling contempt I had grown accustomed to. "Everything they have said is true," he said simply. "I will not insult this chamber or these cadets by claiming otherwise." A murmur swept through the tiered seating, and I saw his mother's expression flicker for the first time, something between shock and a deeper, more complicated grief. "I believed strength meant never being questioned," he continued. "I believed that cadets smaller than myself existed to prove that belief again and again until it became simply how I understood the order of things. I did not consider until Cadet Bennett proved otherwise in front of an entire lecture hall that strength and cruelty are not the same thing, and that mistaking one for the other does not make a person strong. It only makes them small in ways that matter more." The silence that followed his words stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath, uncertain whether what I had just witnessed was genuine remorse or simply a calculated attempt to soften the chamber's judgment before sentencing. Commandant Halden studied Korath for a long moment before speaking, his gravel voice carrying easily across the hushed chamber. Whether this reflection is sincere will be demonstrated by your conduct going forward, not by these words alone, he said. But I acknowledge that acknowledging wrongdoing plainly rather than contesting it through legal maneuvering carries some weight in these proceedings. He turned then to address the full chamber, his expression settling into something formal and final. This academy was founded on the principle that species from across known space could learn, train, and grow together despite our differences, provided that difference in size or strength was never mistaken for difference in worth. What has been revealed in these proceedings represents a failure of that principle, both by Cadet Vest individually and by instructors who dismissed early warnings as mere friction rather than genuine harm. I could feel the weight of the entire chamber's attention as he continued laying out the Academy's findings with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. The pattern of intimidation confirmed the institutional failures, acknowledged the path forward for both discipline and reform laid out in careful, deliberate terms. Whatever came next, whatever sentence or resolution Halden was about to pronounce, I understood that the hearing itself had already accomplished something larger than any single verdict could capture. The truth, so long buried beneath assumptions about who deserved to be believed and who did not, had finally been spoken plainly in front of the entire Academy, and no ruling that followed could ever fully put that truth back into hiding again. Commandant Halden delivered the formal verdict after a brief recess during which the entire chamber sat in a state of restless anticipation, whispered conversations rippling through the tiered seating like static electricity. When he returned to his elevated seat, the room fell silent almost instantly, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would ripple far beyond the walls of that chamber. Cadet Korth Vess, he began, his gravel voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. You are found to have engaged in a sustained pattern of physical intimidation against multiple cadets across a period exceeding one academic term, culminating in a direct physical assault against Cadet Claire Bennett. Your public acknowledgement of these actions has been noted and will be considered in determining the terms of your continued enrollment, but it does not erase the harm already inflicted. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. You are suspended from all Academy activities for the remainder of this term, effective immediately, and reinstatement will be contingent upon successful completion of a formal conduct review program alongside direct restitution to each cadet you have harmed in whatever form those cadets deem appropriate and the Academy deems reasonable. Karatha's shoulders sagged at the words, though he did not protest, did not argue, simply nodded once, and remained standing at attention as Halden's judgment continued to unfold. Furthermore, Halden said, turning his attention to the instructors seated among the observers. This hearing has revealed a troubling pattern of dismissal regarding early reports of misconduct, most notably the characterization of a documented assault as, in the words of the reporting officer at the time, interspecies friction. Effective immediately, all instructional staff will undergo a review of reporting protocols and a new office of cadet advocacy will be established, staffed by representatives from each major species population currently enrolled to ensure that future reports receive the serious consideration they deserve, regardless of the relative size or standing of the cadets involved. A murmur of surprise moved through the chamber at that announcement, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not even fully realized was tight until that moment. This was not simply a punishment handed down to one cadet. This was the beginning of something larger, a genuine acknowledgement that the system itself had failed, and a genuine attempt to repair it. Halden's gaze found mine across the chamber floor, and for a brief moment, something like respect passed between us, unspoken, but unmistakable. Cadet Bennett, he said, addressing me directly now. Your conduct throughout this matter, from the initial incident through your testimony today, reflects values this Academy claims to uphold, but has not always successfully protected. I commend you for your restraint under provocation, and equally for your refusal to remain silent once the full scope of the pattern became clear. I felt heat rise in my cheeks at the public praise, used to this kind of attention after months of deliberately avoiding it, but I held Halden's gaze and offered a small nod of acknowledgement rather than looking away. The hearing adjourned shortly after, and the chamber emptied slowly, cadets clustering in small groups in the corridors outside, Their conversations no longer hushed, but animated, energized by what they had witnessed. I found myself surrounded almost immediately by cadets I barely knew, offering words of support, asking questions about the training techniques I had used, some even asking, half joking and half serious, whether I would be willing to run informal self-defense sessions for smaller-statured cadets who wanted to feel less vulnerable in a school full of species several times their size. Priya found me in the crowd, her earlier nervousness replaced by something brighter, more settled. As if speaking her account aloud in that chamber had lifted a weight she had been carrying for months without fully realizing its size. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not letting my message go unanswered. Thank you for trusting me with it," I answered. Ketvith approached more quietly, his pale lavender features arranged into an expression I had not seen on him before, something like the early stages of ease after prolonged tension. "I will be returning to my original class schedule next term," he said. I had not realized how much smaller my life had become until today, watching it get some of its space back. I told him I was glad and meant it fully, watching him walk away with a straighter posture than I had ever seen him carry before. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the hearing spread through the academy in ways I had not fully anticipated. The new Office of Cadet Advocacy was established within the week, staffed by representatives who quickly became known among the student body as approachable, willing to listen without dismissing concerns as mere friction between species. Several cadets who had never come forward about their own experiences with other aggressive students, not just Korath, began quietly filing reports, emboldened by the visible proof that the academy was finally willing to take such reports seriously. Owen Marsh took to calling me half-jokingly the reason nobody messes with the humans anymore, though I suspected the truth was more complicated than that. It was not that humans had suddenly become feared or untouchable. It was that the assumption underlying so much of the mistreatment, the belief that smaller or physically weaker cadets could be pushed around without consequence, had been publicly and thoroughly dismantled in front of the entire academy. Korath himself I encountered only once more before the end of the term in a quiet corridor near the training yards where he was collecting personal items from a locker assigned to suspended cadets. He looked smaller somehow, not physically. His broad frame remained as imposing as ever, but in the way he carried himself, shoulders less squared, gaze less certain. "I did not expect this outcome," he said when he noticed me passing. "Not the suspension, not the conduct review. I expected either nothing, the way it has always gone before, or perhaps a formal reprimand that would have embarrassed my family without truly costing me anything." "What did you expect from me specifically?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I expected you to remain quiet," he admitted, "as you had for months before that day in the lecture hall. I miscalculated everything about you, from your capability in that classroom to your willingness to speak afterward." I considered his words for a moment before answering. I stayed quiet because I believed it was the safer choice for a long time. I was wrong about that. Silence never protects anyone except the person causing harm. I understand that now in a way I did not before you grabbed my collar in that classroom. Karatha's 4 eyes studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind them. "I hope the conduct review teaches me something useful," he said finally. "I am no longer certain what kind of cadet I want to become, but I know now it is not the one I was." I did not offer him forgiveness in that moment, nor did I feel obligated to. What I offered instead was simply a nod, an acknowledgement that his words had been heard. And then I continued on my way toward the training yards, leaving him to his locker and whatever reflection awaited him during his suspension. Weeks later, as the term drew toward its close, I found myself standing in that same training yard during an evening session, running drills alongside a handful of smaller-statured cadets who had asked, somewhat shyly at first, whether I might show them some of the techniques that had allowed me to counter a Dven cadet nearly twice my size. Priya was among them, along with 2 Tavik cadets and a small-statured Korvith student who moved with surprising quickness despite his species' usual reputation for sturdy, unhurried movement. Watching them practice, watching their confidence build session by session, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since that ordinary morning in Xenobiology 210, when I had been sitting quietly with my stylus resting on a blank data slate, expecting nothing more eventful than a lecture on atmospheric composition. I had spent months believing that the safest path through an academy full of species larger and stronger than myself was invisibility. The careful avoidance of any attention that might mark me as a target. I understood now that invisibility had never actually protected me. It had simply delayed the moment when someone larger and more confident than myself decided my silence meant permission. What had changed everything was not simply the fight itself, though I would not pretend the physical outcome of that confrontation had not mattered. What had truly changed everything was the choice that followed. The decision to speak plainly in front of an entire academy rather than accept a quiet, comfortable exit that would have left Priya, Kent, and others without any acknowledgement of what they had endured. As the training session wound down, and the evening light stretched long shadows across the yard, Owen Marsh jogged over with his usual easy grin, nudging my shoulder lightly with his own. "You know," he said, "you have accidentally started something. Half the smaller cadets on this campus want to learn to fight like you now." "I am not certain fighting is really the point," I answered, watching Priya execute a clean, controlled counter against a training dummy, her form improving visibly even in the short weeks since we had started these sessions. "Then what is the point?" Owen asked. I considered the question for a long moment, watching the training yard around me. Cadets of a dozen species moving through drills beneath the darkening sky. None of them looking over their shoulders the way so many had before, waiting for the next moment. Someone larger decided their comfort mattered more than another's safety. "The point," I said finally, "is knowing you do not have to accept being small in ways that matter, even in a world full of people literally larger than you." Strength was never really about size. It was always about the choice to stand up when it counts and the willingness to keep standing afterward, even when it would be easier to sit back down. Owen considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, his usual joking manner giving way to something more thoughtful. "For what it is worth," he said, "I think you have changed how a lot of people here see themselves. Not just how they see humans, how they see what they are capable of, regardless of what species they happen to be." I did not have a ready answer for that. So I simply watched the training yard for a while longer, the last light of evening catching on the orbital rings visible through gaps in the distant clouds, and allowed myself for the first time in a long while to feel something like genuine peace rather than the constant low simmer of vigilance I had carried since arriving at this academy. The lecture hall where everything had begun sat quiet now in the evening hours. Its rows of empty seats holding no trace of the confrontation that had unfolded there weeks earlier. But something had shifted in that room, and in the corridors beyond it, and in the training yards where cadets once too afraid to speak up now practiced standing their ground without flinching. Korth Vess had attacked me in that classroom, expecting silence, expecting the same quiet compliance he had trained an entire academy to offer him without question. What he found instead was resistance, sharp and immediate. And what followed that resistance was a reckoning neither of us could have fully anticipated on that ordinary morning when I had simply been trying to finish a sentence about atmospheric composition on a distant moon. I closed the training yard gate behind me as the last cadets filtered out into the evening and walked back toward the dormitories beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars, carrying with me the quiet certainty that whatever came next at this academy or beyond it, I would never again mistake silence for safety.